I've been trying to put in here a time, so I just noticed the G roll by. So just a heads up. Carry on.
Parking tickets.
Okay, I think we are ready to get started. In his provocative paper, Joseph Tennis lays out 14 questions about the decisions required of knowledge organization in relationship to 4 precepts in order to achieve what he calls engaged knowledge organization. Joseph is an assistant professor at the Information School at the University of Washington, associate member of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Study at the University of British Columbia, and reviews editor for the Journal of Knowledge Organization. He's also a member of the Dublin Core User Board. He received his MLS from Indiana University and the PhD in Information Science from the University of Washington. He works in classification theory, the versioning of classification schemes in thesauri, and the comparative discursive analysis of metadata creation and evaluation, both contemporary and historical. Please welcome Joseph.
Good afternoon. The abstract has changed from when it was submitted, so I apologize. There won't be so many numbers, a lot more pictures. I was ambitious with 14, to say the least. Can I get the lights dimmed a bit? I think that with the white background and the black text, some of my images might not come through. Thank you. Great. Wonderful. All right, so thank you very much for that introduction, Ed. I'm going to reintroduce myself a little bit to you because some of you may not be familiar with who I am and what I do. I do a lot of this. Let's see. All right. So no, my research is primarily in what I call second-order classificatory processes. First order is the actual methodologies of building and implementing classification schemes. My questions come about after we built them. What happens when we have to version them over time? What happens when we have different implementations according to the same standard? What happens when we have different standards that create quite different implementations in classification? I call all of these second-order classificatory processes. So under the first thing, scheme versioning, I've also called subject ontogeny, so the biologists in here. 0 biologists in here. Okay, I won't explain that. That's then the development of the subject over time. To that end, modeling scheme change, I have talked about how a concept record might be structured so that we can manage change in classification scheme. Here's an example, not detailed obviously, of the fields required that I investigated and proposed for managing scheme change in SCOS. I've also begun case studies of scheme change. I'm looking currently at how eugenics has been handled in the Dewey Decimal Classification from the time that the term appeared in the relative index to the present day. It's fascinating what we're able to find with the Z39.50 protocol, looking for Dewey numbers. We find quite a shift over time from being able to talk about it as a biological science and then shifting out of the biological sciences into medical sciences, social sciences, and philosophy. So there's quite a scatter there in the scheme, probably faithfully so. But what does it mean for managing this published record and access to this published record over time is what I'm asking. I'm also interested in what I call the population perspective of knowledge organization systems. We are living in a Cambrian age of information organization systems. We have folksonomies, we have taxonomies, we have ontologies, we have folksologies. Yes, we do have folksologies as well. Classification schemes, thesauri, etc. What is the purpose of these various schemes is what I also do work in, because we want to know what the purpose is so we can evaluate it. And so I've been able to compare and contrast with PhD student terminological characteristics of these different things and start to show the shape of these. I'm also interested in modeling the diversity of formal knowledge organization processes. This is an excerpt of a paper where I was looking at Ranganathan's faceted and analytico-synthetic classification processes. What does he ask you to go through in order to actually create and use an analytico-synthetic classification scheme? And so I'm starting to model this actual process. And finally, a little bit of whimsy, I'm interested in fringe types in this population perspective. What does it mean when we think that knowledge organization extends all the way into art, all the way into literature, beyond what Richard might have been promoting earlier with pragmatic access, what happens when we get artful with it. And here's an example of the Codex Seraphinianus, a mid-century piece of book art where Luigi Serafini has decided to make up his own world, using his own language to create an encyclopedia. He uses the genre encyclopedia. He has a back of the book index, page numbers, etc., the form, and so that's also what I'm interested in. So my interest in ethics and knowledge organization stem from the design and evaluation of different and diverse populations of knowledge organization practices and structures over time. I do this work to improve the value of knowledge organization, which is rooted squarely in my mind in the self-becoming of individuals through interaction with the cultural record. I'm very concerned with the individual and how they become their full self. Okay, so that's a little bit about me before we start. So what do I mean by precepts for an engaged knowledge organization? In order to talk about this, I want to make 4 assertions, and those will be the pillars of the talk. There'll be 4 sections of this talk. So let's start, shall we? Assertion 1. William Morris responded to the advances of the Industrial Revolution by returning to nature and to history. His work surfaced in the milieu of arts and crafts movement in Britain, and here we see an example of the typefaces he used in his Kelmscott press, which was his hand press work that was trying to raise book production to the level of art. This movement is a response, of course, to the Industrial Revolution. The development of the steam engine by James Watt in 1765 led to the mechanization of industry. Right? So we imagine these factories, we imagine railroads, agriculture and transportation, and changed the life of the working man in Britain. Industrialization left people with the sense that their life had changed, perhaps for the worst, by some people's lights. Many had sacrificed a rural lifestyle, according to these thinkers, of England's green and pleasant land for the sake of a job in the dark, satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. Satanic, right? As a result, they lost that feeling of security and belonging which comes from living in smaller communities. And here's what we might understand to be one of these satanic places. The members of the arts and crafts movement included artists, architects, designers, craftsmen, and writers, multidisciplinary. They feared that industrialization was destroying the environment in which traditional skills and crafts would prosper, as machine production had taken the pride, skill, and design out of the quality of goods being manufactured. Okay, so pride, skill, and design. They were convinced that a general decline of artistic standards brought on by industrialization was linked to the nation's social and moral decline. Okay, so here we have a very interesting perspective of linking the arts to the wider society and also seeing it going on a particular trajectory. So here's assertion 1. We can see this historical conflict as a metaphor between the conflicting stances of work done in knowledge organization today. I'm going to make this assertion, that this metaphor actually holds. We have artisanal work in our knowledge organization systems, I would argue, and work in knowledge organization does not have to be industrialized. Okay, so I'll make that assertion. Assertion 2. As it stands, there are many open questions about ethics in and of knowledge organization, its practice and products. Many of them, and classification, positioned as they are around identity politics of race, gender, and other marginalized groups, ask the classificationist to be mindful of the choice of terms and relationships between terms. To highlight these concerns, scholars have invoked feminist and philosophy of the limit, for example, queer theory, and critical race theory. From this work, we understand that race and gender requires special consideration, which manifests as a particular concern for the form of representation inside extant schemes. Even with these advances in our understanding, there are still other categories about which we must make decisions and take action. For example, there are ethical decisions about fiduciary resource allocation, which have come up during the course of this workshop. Political decisions about standards adoption also been brought up. And even broader zeitgeist considerations like the question of Fordist conceptions of the mechanics of description, and here I mean industrialization as well. Right? and the representation present in much of today's practice versus a more Morris-esque arts and crafts version of the same. Ford, of course, right, said you can have any color Model T as long as it was black, right? So what does that mean, given pride, skill, and design description? Just as taking action in a particular way is an ethical concern, so too is avoiding a lack of action. Scholars in knowledge organization have also looked at the absence of what we might call right action in the context of cataloging and classification. This leads to some problems related to identity, mentioned above, and hints at larger ethical concerns, namely watching a subtle semantic violence persist in our systems without intervention. And here I cite David Bade. Unfortunately, he's not here today, but his colorless green ideals in language of bibliographic description is an example of error in shared cataloging records. And we can also see Bowker and Starr looking at some of the infrastructural issues related to classification. So I can make assertion 2 now. Not taking right action in knowledge organization practice is an act of violence. Assertion 3. Do we know him? Not yet. We will maybe once I say his name. Slavoj Žižek, in his Violence, describes 3 forms that frame our understanding of the same: subjective violence, symbolic violence, and systemic violence. The latter 2 he both calls objective, in contrast to the subjective. Okay? So we've got subjective, symbolic, and systemic. Subjective violence is carried out by a subject, an actor, an identifiable agent. Clear examples of subjective violence are ready at hand. Okay? They're acts of crime, terror, civil unrest, and international conflict. Okay? Ready at hand. When we think of violence, this is our common sense understanding of violence. The 2 forms of objective violence are not as obvious. Žižek's analysis, these other forms of violence are embedded and invisible to most of our observations. Okay? They require a hermeneutics of suspicion to pull them out. Objective violence forms the status quo against which we measure our subjective violence. We assume that these are nonviolent in order to suss out subjective violence. Symbolic violence is the universe of meaning imposed by language on a group of people and systemic language. Okay? Systemic violence is the consequences, often catastrophic, of the smooth functioning of economic and political systems. Okay? Now, we can see this, perhaps, quite clearly in knowledge organization systems by the need of Aboriginal groups to construct their own terminologies. No longer is a colonial terminology good enough for Maori, for example, who have now constructed, according to Maori epistemology, their own subject headings and use them in cataloging Maori materials. The most striking example of violence Žižek calls out is the violence of the liberal communist. This is someone who has made money, thereby taking it from others, he argues, and has turned around to fix the problems of underprivileged and developing world contexts. This asserts a particular socio-political stratification, that is, the liberal global capitalist democracy. Okay? Now this is a nuanced argument, not one that I fully buy into, mind you, but it's one he advances as the clear example. So when someone amasses millions of dollars and then turns around and decides to cure disease with the money, there may be something systemically violent about the reallocation of those funds he calls us to question. In knowledge organization, it is easy to see that objective violence can surface in our work, right? Especially because it's rooted in what Žižek calls both symbols and systems. First, we use symbolic systems of language, and even its more refined subset, indexing languages, right? Often controlled, these indexing languages are. So we're working with these languages, imposing them on others. And we operate within systems, right, as defined by Žižek, that are part of a socio-political system, legitimated as components to help the capitalist, democratic citizen. Okay, so we had talked about, I think yesterday, some sort of communist ideal within lending and sharing. Both are systemic structures, institutions that require us to investigate. We can further refine symbolic violence, I think, by identifying 3 types pertinent to knowledge organization. Now, these are mine, not Zizek's. Semantic violence, conceptual violence, and reference violence. Now, I do not like these terms. Okay? I haven't found any better ones yet. So if you can help, that would be great. So briefly, these are defined thus. Semantic violence, the renaming of an extant body of thought, you could say extant body of literature, without authority to do so. Okay? So particular to knowledge organization, we may be engaged in an act of violence when we engage in an act of renaming, imposing something that was not there. Of course, we rely on literary warrant and a common sense appeal to the fact that the author is speaking for him or herself when they write. However, the authority of structure of the indexing language lies with us, so we might be engaged in that form of violence there. Conceptual violence, refusal to link bodies of knowledge together in topical discussion or representation. This is less about KO in my mind than it is about quote-unquote new fields of research that emerge without deference to the published literature on the same topic. And I suppose this is the mix in me of librarian and academic at this point, asking people to do literature searches before they start talking about archiving, particularly. But this is a sort of conceptual violence, erasure, if you will, of what's come before, especially since KO attempts to make available, to make accessible what has come before. I think this is actually a type of conceptual violence. And finally, reference violence, a refusal to cite requisite literature or another way instantiate for the purposes of retrieval. And so this is, again, a kind of silencing or erasure, but specifically through citation. And we can do this as well within our scope notes in managing structures and indexing languages as well, the definitions we opt for and reference and don't reference. Now, I want to say one more thing. I use the word violence, which may actually itself be a very violent term, but I think there is nuance to it here, as opposed to being a heavy-handed club. So I'm hoping that will come across. These kinds of violences are in accord with other work in this area, work that asks us to consider the power to name, which has been referenced a number of times, and also more controversial work, or perhaps reminiscent of the 1960s liberation movements, work that wants to take the DIC out of dictionary. And here I'm referencing Mary Daly's Wikidary, the Webster's New Intergalactic Wikidary for Wild Women, where she attempts to erase patriarchal remnances of language by constructing her own terminology. From that particular text is where I got the term academia, which I use quite often in referring to the place that I work. I'm indebted to her for a number of things. That's one of them. So now we can make assertion 3. Objective violence, which is both symbolic and systemic, is potentially present in contemporary acts of knowledge organization. The image of Zizek helped you through that, didn't it? It was instructive, right? Assertion 4. It would seem to me that if we buy the assertion that objective violence can surface in our work, then we have ethical decisions. We have to make ethical decisions to prevent it. Okay? If we establish the perspective that knowledge organization, its practice, and its products are at least complicit, if not tools for propagating violence as outlined above, we are then forced to engage with this new stance. I would argue that the action advocated by an ethical consideration for knowledge organization, in this case, right action, is an engaged one. And it is here where I can take a non-contemporary ethical theory advanced by engaged Buddhism. In this context, we can see the manifestation of precepts that guide ethical action and warn against the lack of action. To this end, I'll offer preliminary thoughts only, given time constraints, on the precepts for an engaged knowledge organization. The abstract, of course, promised 14. I will be giving you 2. Okay? I will model these off of Thich Nhat Hanh's Interbeing. Are we familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh? With Interbeing? Okay, so Thich Nhat Hanh, Zen Buddhist master, his Sangha, his group, Buddhist group, came out of the Vietnam War with a set of precepts about interbeing, basically about being with other human beings. And a lot of engaged Buddhism, that is social action fueled by Buddhist philosophy and beliefs, grows out of that effort, and others. I'm using his. So in his first precept, Thich Nhat Hanh tells us, do not be idolatrous about or bound to any doctrine, theory, or ideology, even Buddhist, and I parenthetically added professional ones. All systems of thought are guiding means. They are not absolute truth. Okay? Here we can see that we're attempting to get at symbolic violence with this precept, I think, through detachment specifically, right? We don't need our identity permanently attached to a doctrine. And I think that can be actually separated. We don't need it attached to a doctrine, a theory, or an ideology, even professional ones. I think they are open to introspection, especially if indeed some of them might be part of systemic violence. And then the second one I'll offer for thought is his second precept. Do not think that knowledge you presently possess is changeless. Absolute truth. Avoid being narrow-minded and bound to present views. Learn and practice non-attachment from views in order to be open to receive others' viewpoints. Truth is found in life and not merely in conceptual knowledge. Okay, so there's action here. There is an action or a pragmatic approach here. Be ready to learn throughout your entire life and to observe reality in yourself and in the world at all times. So here we see an amplification, I think, of the first precept. It is key for semantic, conceptual, and reference violence, I believe. We have to be able to change our schemes, should violence appear in them, and learn our whole working life and beyond. Okay? There are many more precepts that we can and should review and or create to accommodate objective violence in our systems. I won't do that here today, but I promise you it will be a project that I'll be working on for some time. But here we can make assertion 4. Engaged knowledge organization acknowledges objective violence in our work and works towards the following guiding precepts to teach us how to work with awareness and to work less violently. And now with 10 minutes I'll conclude. I've made 4 assertions in the course of this paper. 1, we can see this historical conflict between industrial revolution and the arts and crafts movement as a metaphor for conflicting stances in our work done in knowledge organization today. Not taking right action in knowledge organization practice is an act of violence. Objective violence, that is both symbolic and systemic, is potentially present in contemporary acts of knowledge organization. Engaged knowledge organization acknowledges objective violence in our work and works towards following guiding precepts to teach us how to work with awareness and work less violently. Now we can connect assertion 1 with the rest. In order to make tractable the idea of precepts of engaged knowledge organization, we need to acknowledge the conflict present in contemporary bureaucratic practices of knowledge organization and the art and craft of description. And this is a theme that has surfaced today magically, I think. So how fortuitous for me to be saying this now. We have a systemic violence at work in our factory life of 19th century Britain. It might be possible to see systemic violence at work in our bureaucratic routine and the design and maintenance of knowledge organization systems, writ large, again, from a population perspective. I'm not talking about one particular practice. The upshot, then, is perhaps a need for an artistic turn in descriptive practices. Is there such a thing as a beautiful description? Do we already know what that is? Many of us probably do. Is there such a thing as an artistic description? Can these be defined by an awareness of objective violence, whether it's symbolic or systemic? Is there a need to react against industrialization and, by extension, objective violence in knowledge organization? Perhaps a description should be recast as art, like hand-pressed books, even in a diverse environment, for example, with Kindles. And once we assemble this bricolage, we still have to deal with potential violence at work, but at least we are aware of it. And this is Picasso's Guernica, right? Regardless, we'll feel this tension, and it will be an ethical compass of knowledge organization that guides us through the conflict. Perhaps we must formulate what it means in knowledge organization to first do no harm. Thank you.
Questions for Joseph?
Yes, please.
I have a friend who has 3 kids, has 3 children, and she said to me once, every night I make dinner and someone gets screwed. So I'm hearing what you're saying with violence, and I'm thinking, no matter how do you get away from describing something, somebody, somewhere, somehow is going to be the victim
Yes.
of an act of violence.
I think, yes, exactly. I did not have time to probe the non-binary aspect of precepts in engaged Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism in general, but there are 5 different levels of intentionality that have been probed in the philosophy. And one is to intentionally do harm, right? To intentionally kill, right? And then there's a gradation from that point on to accidentally stepping on an ant as you're walking into the zendo. So there are levels in which we can be self-reflexive here. What's the intention? And that's really what I think this calls to the fore. If we're sensitized to the fact that there may be violence, right? That language, we've been talking for a while, that language is not neutral, but what if we realized that there was actually something more at work here, something more powerful here at work? We might be able to probe our intentions. And that's the point here. Does that help?
Yeah, because otherwise we're just sort of sitting here paralyzed.
Precisely. No, exactly. No, exactly. If it's a binary decision, then we've got a real problem. There's nuance to it. Yes, please.
Yeah, just before you started talking, I actually made a note of asking myself, what is the link between ethics and aesthetics? Apart from the fact that they both Greek words. And I was thinking that aesthetics really is also a matter of respecting the sensibilities or the needs of users. So there's an ethical dimension to aesthetics as well. What this really was prompted by is my reflection on doing OPEC searches in the last couple of months. Why are OPEC so jolly ugly? And so counterintuitive and such a good to use. So perhaps we should be having a conference sometime on the aesthetics of information knowledge organization.
I would love that. That's a wonderful idea. Yes, please. One of the most revealing books, I think, as far as trying to link these two, was, in my mind at least, was Elaine Scarry's short book, which was on beauty. And she does try to talk about the golden rule and what makes it so golden, right? The idea that there's a symmetry, or even more so, that it wants to be, something that's beautiful wants to be replicated. So it wants to be, not that it is, that it wants to be. And so I found, I carry that as sort of in my back pocket when I first started to think about aesthetics. It's not where I stopped, but it's definitely where I start at this point in my life. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I just want to jump off, use as a point of departure your response to Amy's question. We've also talked about different groups of people, you know, musicologists, astronomers, chemists, and so forth, philosophers, to not to do any intentional harm to one group is all fine and good, but you could possibly, I don't want to say this, you could possibly describe material, provide access to material for one group that would do harm to another group. But at the same time, this other group would never look at this information because it's a discrete and separate group.
Right.
So how do you reconcile that in a whole schema of standards?
I don't have, I mean, it's all contextual, right, of course. How this level of intentionality toward doing harm, how accidental is it, how incidental is it? But two things. One, purpose, right? So one of the things that we want to be true to is our purpose. If our purpose is to follow a standard, then we be true to our purpose. If our purpose is to help as many people get to information as possible, then we be true to our purpose. And returning to those fundamentals, I think, is very important consistently, which brings me to the second point, which is that once we do description, it doesn't mean that we have to stop describing. Once we do description once, yes, it's labor intensive, and that's one of the things that the metaphor also holds, I think, between the arts and crafts movement and the Industrial Revolution, is that groups are going to change, individuals are going to come and go out of groups, and as a consequence, the composition of them is going to change. Our descriptions often stay static unless there's an error, or unless there's a batch upload, or unless there's a global change we can make. And maybe we start to think about them as dynamic, and maybe on long-term scales, not short-term scales. But there's been archaeological evidence that even the most ancient sites, astronomical sites, had to make corrections over time because we don't think the stars move that much, but over the history of people on this planet, they have. So they've had to move sacred sites just a little bit to account for where Venus rises. And maybe the same metaphor could apply to what we're doing with our description. Maybe.
Joe, and after your wonderful presentation, and now taking a look to the suggested imaging of predicament, because I realized how deep and how comprehensive the concept violence is to knowledge organization. And when you presented your four postulate, I tried to travel in your metaphor, and I could compare. I was having that with Jen. I could compare the principles that you postulate to the same principles to the fusionary Italian movement of slow food, which in fact has an deep ethical commitment. So I appreciate very much your
Thank you for sharing that. A colleague of mine at the University of Washington and I are going to hopefully start working on how people describe the arc of taste for the slow food movement that started in Italy and is now gone across the world. I'm really looking forward to it. But you're right, there is this deep localization that's required, I think, in these cases. Thank you.
Another question, the gentleman in the back.
Joseph, can you speak to the concept of harm? I'm well aware of the concept of potentiality, things in Russian philosophy and so on, but my kind of concern becomes many fundamentalist Christians would argue that the fact that LGBT materials even exist harms them. Many of us would think that's a crazy idea. So what kind of harm are we talking about? Because again, if we're going to describe these materials, we've now, at least in some people's mind, become explicitly complicit in harming them. So what's the concept of harm?
Yes, it's an excellent question and an excellent example. My question yesterday to David Bain was about belief, because I've rooted this in what some might consider a religion, almost everybody would consider a religion, Buddhism, which has a set of beliefs, right? And at some level we get to that, and in some cases we get to it quite quickly in knowledge organization. And I am not proposing any answers or ameliorations at that level whatsoever. That is, again, local. One of the issues that I currently strongly support, but not without levels of gradation, is a self-determination and self-becoming. And people should have the ability to do that locally. Again, ideally, not doing harm to others in the process of doing it.
It's actually one thing I was thinking of during your talk, is connecting back to some of the talks about tagging. And then it almost seems to me that despite all the benefits of tagging, it also opens up an arena in which we are offering and allowing people to exert violence towards other groups, because they're not, unlike catalogers, they're not being asked to subscribe to professional principles. They're not being asked to set aside their own needs. They're being asked to exert their own needs, which may in fact be very hurtful to other people.
And I have an ongoing casual sort of armchair study of the tags affiliated with Ann Coulter's work on Amazon.com. I've been doing it now since 2007, and I take screenshots because Amazon scrubs it every once in a while. And at ACES 2008, 2007, I presented on sort of public space in tagging and what's sort of the civility of public space in a tagging environment. And the first tag with over 90 other hits was Burr Vomit. And it went south from there. So and polarizing, of course, you know. Then there was truth and all of these other sort of tags affiliated with this. But I encourage you to go take a look at those tags, Amazon.com, because it's just an example of this. I would have provided you, if this were more of a funny talk, I would have, or not funny, it's not funny, but more of a lively talk than I would have provided is that I didn't think I had time or space. And it's worth looking at.
Yes.
One of the other elements that you raise when we begin to talk about aesthetics is we begin to talk about the art object. And when we begin to talk about the object, the focus is on the piece, either the piece being created, the piece being designed, and there may be a certain number of elements that inform our approach to the piece, but the focus is the piece. It's not the audience.
That's right. And this is one of the interesting tensions, right? When we think about works of literature or even nonfiction having an audience, but still being some artful form. So there's a genre there, I think, that we can try to develop. But you're right. They're the object, especially in the case with hand-pressed books. You don't care whether there's Chaucer or not. You care how it's printed. So it's not the content, and nor is it really the audience. It's just the object itself. I completely appreciate that, and I will be sensitive to it going forward. Thank you.